Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We're going to start. So we're here today to discuss the topic understanding and using other effective area-based conservation measures to reach the 30 by 30 target in the Mediterranean. This webinar is organized by the Specially Protected Area Regional Activity Center under the Barcelona Convention, also known as the SPARAC, together with the IUCN Med and Blue Seeds, and under the umbrella of Together for the Med. Those of you who don't know our partnership yet, Together for the Med is a partnership created in 2017 to bring together 50 organizations, including NGOs, research centers, regional institutions, and other types of organizations that came together to protect the Mediterranean biodiversity and support coastal communities. Our aim as Together for the Med is to foster collaboration and knowledge exchange in the Mediterranean, hence this webinar. The partnership is supported by Pure Bertarelli Ocean Legacy and is jointly coordinated by IUCN Med and by Blue Seeds, which is why we're really happy to co-organize together this webinar and with our precious member, the SPARAC, who's here with us today. In this panel today, we have a very high-level panel, starting with Yaprak Arda. Yaprak, you have an academic background in marine biodiversity and conservation, with more than 12 years now of experience in marine conservation. And today you're the Marine Program Officer for IUCN Med, which means that you are coordinating the strategic line on MPAs and OECMs. So right on point for this webinar. We also have with us Asma Keriji. You've been working for the SPARAC for no more than 11 years, and you currently run the Specially Protected Area Program. That means that you focus on the creation and effective management of MPAs, of specially protected areas of Mediterranean importance, so the SPAMEs, and of OECMs. We also have François Simard. You're now an independent consultant, but you're also an internationally renowned scientist for your work broadly in marine ecology, but also more specifically on area-based conservation, so including MPAs and OECMs. Among the different experiences that you've had, you've worked also for the IUCN, and you coordinated the Mediterranean Marine Program, as well as the Global Marine and Polar Program. And finally, last but not least, Sue Wells, you're with us today. You have a very diverse and rich work in marine conservation. You work in many organizations, including TRAFFIC, the UN Environmental Programme, and the World Conservation Monitoring Center. You work for the IUCN, for Fauna and Flora International, and for WWF. Currently, among other things, you're the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, and more specifically for the MPA Management Effectiveness Task Force. And you're also working with the SPARAC on the development of the guidance documents on OECMs that we are going to talk about today. With these great speakers, here's the brief overview of the agenda for today's event. We will start with warm-up questions. I will go on to that in a minute. We will start with background and definitions, thanks to François. Then Yaprak is going to help us navigate the OECM pathways to go beyond protected areas. And there will then be a presentation of the latest guidance documents by the SPARAC, thanks to Asma and Sue. And we will try and keep at least 45 minutes for Q&A before we close the webinar. A few housekeeping rules for this webinar to make sure that it works well. So as you've heard, the webinar is recorded. It will be made available at the end of the meeting. We ask you to keep your microphones off. We are many people in the room today and we want to really hear what the speakers have to say. However, it's still going to be highly interactive and we count on your questions. For those, please ask them throughout the entire webinar. When you think of a question, you can directly ask them during the presentation and we'll come back to it at the end. And for us to more easily find back the questions, we will ask you to put them in the Q&A section. So on your Zoom window, you can see on your bottom bar that there's the chat on the left, and on the right, there's a Q&A section. If you cannot see it, it's because it's hidden under the plus section and the three little dots. If you click the plus, you can see the Q&A section. And so please ask your question there. That's going to be a bit easier. That's it for this short introduction and housekeeping. We're going to start now with some of your inputs. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to invite you to a little app called Mentimeter. You're going to be able to stay in the Zoom. There are going to be a few questions that are going to appear on your screen on the right. So I'm going to ask you to answer to these questions. That's going to be useful to understand who you are and what are the expectations that you have for this webinar. So you should soon be able to see the first question. So the first question is about which country you are based in. Where do you listen to us from, please, so that we know a little bit more who's where. So I see some people in France, both on the Mediterranean coast, but also more in the center. I see people from the Balearics. Welcome, people in Tunisia, people in Morocco, in Italy. Okay, good representation of the Mediterranean. Of course, if you're not from the Med, you're also very welcome to this webinar. You can you hear
Margot,
me?
you're muted.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Can you still hear me? Well, you can see also on the map anyway that everyone is based all around the Mediterranean. And I was saying that our colleagues from outside the Mediterranean are, of course, welcome to the webinar, even if they're not based around this sea. And you can just let us know in the chat from where you listen to us. And you can put yourself where you would like to be on this map. Okay, thank you very much. I will go to the next question as I feel like the answers have stopped a little bit from coming, but I see that there's a really good representation of countries. So welcome everyone. And I see people from South Africa. Well, that's really far. Welcome to the webinar. So in the next question, it's going to be about the type of organization that you belong to. Are you an NGO? Are you a regional institution, academia? Do you belong to the private sector? Are you a government representative? That includes also regional or local decision maker. You can put yourself in that category. And if you don't feel represented by any of these categories, you can put yourself in other. And again, so that we have a bit more details, feel free to add it in the chat, because I see that we already have 6 people who feel that they are not in this category. So I'm very curious to know which type of organizations. We see a high participation from NGOs, which is not necessarily surprising, especially with the webinar organized under the umbrella of Together for the Med, because we have a lot of NGOs in our partnership. I will give you a few seconds more to answer, and then we will go to the question. Oops. Okay, the question is really interesting for us and for the rest of the webinar. How familiar do you think you are with OECMs? So I see that there were 5s already, some people that are very, very familiar. If you have no idea what that is, then you can put 1. And if you already know exactly what we will be talking about, you can put 5. Well, it's a bit more cautious now. I see that not everyone is completely familiar. For those of us who are joining as we speak, as there are newcomers still joining this webinar, you can directly join these questions and let us know how familiar with OECMs you think you are, so that we know also in which level of detail we need to be for this webinar. And without so much surprise, it's a little bit somehow in the middle, 3 a little bit above average. So we have people who were interested enough with OECMs to join this webinar, but maybe not completely familiar either. So I think that the rest of the presentation is going to be really interesting. And the last question is maybe the most interesting for us. So here you can directly type your answer. Please don't go into too much detail so that we can still see it. It doesn't need to be very long, but just briefly, what do you expect from this webinar? What are you eager to learn? Is it more for learning? Is it for practical information? Is it a follow-up? Yeah. Okay, so I see the goal is to boost the designation in the med. Of course, yes, that's definitely part of the aim of this partnership, of this webinar. Okay, it's coming in. Basic understanding, what classifies as OECM in marine context. Yes. More examples of potential OECMs in Europe. Understand the application of the concept in the marine environment, practical information and solutions, learn more and get practical advice, staying updated and deepening your skills, peer learning and knowledge exchange. That's definitely why we're here. Practical information. I think we aimed to have also this webinar as a practical step towards OECM. So all the answers revolve around the concept of OECMs, which is a really good sign. How to identify and designate an OECM. I guess we'll come back on that with the speakers. Keep informed of future prospects. Okay. Understand how effectiveness is measured in OECM. Do OECMs really exist beyond a handful of examples per region? Yes, we'll go also on some examples and what can be OECMs and what they are. The key differences from other instruments, OECMs specifically in the med, and how they are defined in the framework of the ongoing marine spatial planning. Okay, we have a lot of responses. I'm not going to go into all of them, but thank you so much for participating. I'm going to close now this Q&A session because I think we already have a lot. That's going to be also useful for our speakers, and especially for the first one who's going to present definitions of OECMs. I think that's going to answer to some of your questions already, and the background for the creation. So François, we'll stop the collaboration on this Mentimeter. Thank you for all your answers, and I will let you share your screen and start your presentation.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your invitation to this webinar, and happy to be here with you with many good colleagues. Here I am. Is that fine?
I think it's perfect.
It's perfect.
Getting full
Wow.
screen.
It's too much.
Thank you.
So again, thank you very much for inviting me here. And so I'm François Simard. Thank you for your introduction. I'm now, as you said, more my consultant, but I'm happy to be retired. And happy also to participate to the brainstorming session or the session on all the marine conservation. I will try to give you some basic thinking about OECMs. Where are we coming from, and why it is so important to look at it into very details to really achieve something with this new tool. It's not extremely new because, as you can see on my first slide, it has been created in 2010 in the COP10 in Nagoya. At that time, we needed targets, and it's a long time ago, but we try to have targets for marine conservation, but for conservation in general, and not also for marine. And so we decided to have this 10% and 17% for terrestrial. We are now far from this because we are 30% for both. But at that time, this 10% was quite also a challenge. And during the discussion in Nagoya, and we felt the need to not only looking at protected areas, but also looking at other, and it came in the definition, other effective area conservation measures. It's a need for the conservation community to look at other measures, because we had in mind that some of the military zone or fisheries reserve were having some really conservation. They were achieve some conservation. So recognize that was really important. But at the same time, we kept with this other effective area-based conservation measure, and I'm strong on the other because other is not defined by definition. It's something else, you know. So I would say it's the original sin of this conservation tool is that it's not defined. We accept in 2010 to have something which is clearly not defined. And this was quite an issue. It has been slipping for years, and finally, 2 years before the COP15, where in 2020 it was we were looking at this target. Did we achieve this target or not? We think we should have a definition of OECMs, and so the real definition of OECMs came really in 2018, and you can see that it is in the definition of the target 3 of GBF. So what is this definition? I will read it once, and but everybody maybe knows that: a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in-situ conservation of biodiversity with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socio-economic, and other locally relevant values. And we'll get back to all the parts of the definitions. It's interesting to put that in parallel with the CBD Article 2 definition on protected area, because it's very similar. At the end of the day, somebody can say, well, it's the same thing. But the OECM, it's clearly not a protected area. So the overall difference is the destination. Destination of a protected area is to protect, and the destination of an OECM is to do something else, but it will deliver conservation. So this is the important point to note from the beginning. So regarding marine, well, there are a lot of tools that are used for marine management that can be seen as OECMs. the fisheries management area, the fisheries reserve. The communities area managed for extraction of marine products. So it's kind of very local fisheries. This is more relevant in developing countries. Marine coastal management systems managed primarily for tourism. Wind farm, oil platform, aquaculture facilities, all kind of facilities are in the sea and that exclude other activities. Marine areas that are set aside for other purpose than conservation, but has that indirect conservation benefits, as military training areas, or of course, the previous one is also more or less within this category. And larger areas where certain species are protected by law across the entire region. We'll come back to all of this, looking at the element of the definition. I have to mention a very, very important publication by IUCN called Guidance on OECMs, made under the leadership of Hadi Jonas, who is leading the working group on OECMs. And this this publication is key for if you want to understand more and apply and use OECM. And one of the points that is really important here is that an OECM is managed and is used for basis of orange boxes, but also it has to be really delivering important conservation. So this is really key. But looking back at the definition, and word by word, I will go through that quite quickly. A geographically defined area. This is very important. It cannot be, an ocean can be a place where it's not clearly defined. Having said that, for marine, there is some important points in the definition. It can be defined in exceptional circumstances by physical features that move over time. And this is in the text. I think this is very key for marine, more than coastal. For coastal, probably normal kind of boundaries are okay. If we go for open sea, let's say, not high sea, but open sea, it's important to look at some features that move over time. I mean, thermal fronts, for example, are really important to define marine habitats. And as marine experts, as marine biologists, as marine ecologists, we have to look at that kind of possibility. I don't say that all OECMs or MPAs, in this case, it's valid also for MPAs, should be defined by physical features, but it's something that we should have in mind. Then the second point is other than a protected area. Okay, that's clear. The only question here that we can have in mind is why it is not a protected area, and this is a question that is really under all the thinking about OECMs. If we go for OECMs, we should not go for protected areas, because we are talking about nature conservation, biodiversity conservation in any case. The next point is which is governed and managed, and this is also a very important point when you look at the example that I raised before, including a military zone or including other kind of exclusion zone. Of course, all that kind of zone are managed in a way, but it should be managed in order to deliver a conservation. So here we are in the center also of the issue. How an area which is created for another purpose than marine conservation can be managed for marine conservation. And this is something which is very important. And managing also means that having action against any kind of threats. It is noted here then that manage can include a decision to leave the area untouched, which doesn't say to do nothing, because to leave it untouched also means that it should be kept untouched by management. Next point is in ways that achieve positive outcomes. So here is again the main point that I was mentioning before. The destination, the conservation outcome is the same than protected area, but the origin and the journey may be very different. How we achieve here conservation is just because there is a place which is achieving conservation that it can be on OECM. It's not a place that is aiming at. So in a way, OECM can be even stronger than a protected area, because you all know the issue of paper parks. With the designation of a protected area, which in reality does not much. OECMs cannot be on a paper OECM. If a place does not deliver conservation, it cannot be an OECM. If it delivers conservation, then it can be an OECM. So this is quite also an interesting point to mention here. Sustained long-term outcomes. And here again, it's a very important point, because long-term is a really key point for all conservation. We should also always look at long-term, and long-term means no end, no planned end. It's not ending. When amongst marine or conservation people, when we say long-term, it means that there is no end, no term indeed. And here we have a real issue with many kind of OECMs, especially in most of our countries. The marine is under the public domain, and for doing things in the public domain, you need authorization from the government, and those authorizations are given for some years, maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe more, maybe 100, but still, it's given for a number of years. And this is a point that is quite complicated to manage when we discuss OECMs. But it has to be thought and to be cleared. For the in situ, this is not really valid for marine conservation, so I will pass. And then the two last part of the definition is about conservation of biodiversity and with associated ecosystem function and services. Conservation of biodiversity is clear enough. Here I put the definition of biodiversity from which is in the CBD, and ecosystem services. It's important for marine, because we really need to look at ecosystem services. The definition says that the guideline says that it should not interfere with conservation of important biodiversity. So it's not ecosystem protecting ecosystem services versus conservation of biodiversity. It should be both. And this is something that is important for many people, because we are talking here about provision of food, provision of water, regulating services, nutrient cycling, and cultural values. And so, I mean, this is quite something we should look at too. The last part is, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. And the guidelines are quite say not much about one point, which is quite important here for us, is the socioeconomic. And socioeconomic values is something that an OECM can protect or conserve. So here is something to dig in. And I think this is a point that is not developed so much in the guideline, but which is very important for marine OECMs. I would like, my two last slides are one about the objectives. It is noted that there might be three kind of conservation objective: primary conservation, secondary, and ancillary. Primary conservation, primary is when your objective is to make marine conservation. And in this case, as I said before, in my opinion, we should go for a protected area, an MPA, and not for an OECM if the primary objective is conservation. But there are cases where, for any kind of reason, in the guidelines they talk about a lot about indigenous people and local communities, but it might be also government that doesn't want to have a protected area because it goes along some lines, and they prefer to have OECMs. But I would say that, generally speaking, if your primary goal is conservation, please go for a protected area and not for an OECM. Secondary conservation, it refers to sites which have a primary goal, which might be, let's say, aquaculture, wind farming, fisheries protection. And this goal is a primary goal, and as a secondary objective, it has conservation. So this is fine, and I think this is kind of pure kind of OECMs. And the third one is ancillary conservation. Ancillary conservation is also very important. It's a site which is not dedicated to conservation at all, but it has outcomes of conservation. And this is not an easy one because for the reason of long-term, for the reason of management, for the reason of governance that I mentioned before, but it is also important to look at that. And as a last line for this introduction, and I hope I could answer some of your questions, why non-conservation agencies, which are government or whatever they are, should be interested in OECMs. First, to recognize that what they do as non-conservation is important for conservation, as conservation values. Second, opportunities for collaboration. When you do conservation by chance or by opportunity, or because you want to do conservation for also what your job is, it's good to collaborate with conservation-related agencies, and it will recognize at the same time and enhance your action. So recognition of the importance of other groups. I mean, there are a lot of groups that are working for conservation and that are recognized for that. And this is through OECMs, they can be recognized. And of course, putting together this funding opportunities, and new business can emerge from looking at OECMs. Yes, that's it. I hope I could answer some of your questions, and I'm happy to answer more questions in the chat or in the Q&A session afterward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francois, for this first presentation.
Yes.
Yes, I also hope and think it answered some questions. If it raised new questions, feel free to add them in the chat already, and we will do our best to answer that in the Q&A session. Yaprak, you can already start sharing your screen, and we will go directly into the second presentation. Make sure that we also finish on time and leave this time for interactive session. Yaprak, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and see my screen well. Okay, well, I would like to thank Margot and also Francois for setting this scene for my presentation. Well, as Margot introduced, I am Yaprak Arda, the Marine Program Officer of IUCN Med, and I am focusing on the OECMs and MPAs strategy for IUCN Med. So today, I will reflect a bit on the OECMs, navigating the pathway of OECMs, getting a bit more into the technical part of OECMs. So before we dive in, I would like to show these maps actually from the protected planets. And as you see, this is on the left-hand side, when you look at the globe, this is the recent updated protected planets map taken from January 2026. And as you can see on the globe, it basically reflects on the terrestrial and inland waters, protected areas, marine protected areas, and OECMs, and also terrestrial protected areas areas as well. So if you were to actually log on to Protected Planet, you would be able to, scan through these maps, not just at the global level, but also at the regional and also by the country or national level as well. But when we look into the global map and also a bit on the Mediterranean map, so we see that at the moment, in terms of protected areas, including terrestrial and inland waters, we are around 16.5% at the global level. And when we reflect into the marine protected areas, it's currently just 9.6%. And of course, if we were to include the OECMs into this picture, we see that the terrestrial and inland waters protected areas with the OECM coverage increases almost 1%. And a bit less for the marine protected areas when we include the OECMs. So we know that these percentages are way behind the 30 by 30 goals. And we are now in 2026. So we need to know, we all know that, we need to speed up the process a bit. So when we reflect into the Mediterranean map, you see on the right-hand side, there's a snapshot of the Mediterranean from the World Protected Planets website, and also a map made by the MapAMed, which is actually the map for the Mediterranean. And I tried to capture the marine protected areas OECMs and some of the potential OECMs, both terrestrial and marine, in the Mediterranean. So as we all know that in the Mediterranean at the moment, we have terrestrial OECMs, but currently we do not have any marine OECMs. But we know that there are some potential ones underway, which my colleagues will present after my presentation. So we have seen these maps. So how those maps actually reflect the OECMs? What is the process behind? So how do we actually declare OECMs? How do we assess them? How we recognize them? And how those OECMs get into those maps? So I will try to give a bit more detail about these processes. So the first initial step is actually the identification of OECMs, which involves the site level assessment tool. This tool, which you can see, is actually a publication of IUCN with contribution of organizations, many other organizations, and it's available online. So basically it gives you guidance on how to identify and recognize OECMs. So there are three main steps for identification of OECMs, and the initial step is actually the screening of proposed OECM or OECMs at the national level. And within that step, there are two criteria, and the main output of this step is a site that meets the screening criteria is a potential OECM, is to decide if a site fits into the OECM criteria or not. And then comes the second step. If you think that that area is a potential OECM, then you move on to the second step, the securing the consent of the key stakeholders, which is actually the step before the full assessment to get the consent from the stakeholders. So the main output for this second step is a potential OECM where governing authority, indigenous peoples and local communities and other right holders have given consent to carry out the full assessment as the candidate OECM. So if you have the consent from all the key stakeholders, then you can actually move on to the next step, which is the full assessment step, which includes 6 criteria. And the main output for this is that a candidate OECM that meets all the criteria is confirmed as an OECM site, and that do not meet all the criteria, and the sites that do not meet all the criteria remain as a candidate OECM pending further information or changes to meet the criteria. So you see that it is a dynamic process. So if you do not have a site, if the full assessment does not end up being an OECM, it does not mean it's the end. You can always go back and reassess these sites if it were to meet the certain criteria indicated in the site level assessment tool. And this tool is available in different languages. So what are some of the key considerations and enabling conditions for OECMs? So identifying and reporting a site as an OECM recognizes that a site contributes towards the long-term and effective conservation of biodiversity, even though it's not a protected area. So once an OECM is reported, it can be included in database of countries' biodiversity conservation contributions to international environmental agreements, in particular, actually the ones that we all very well, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, such as the Target 3, 30 by 30 percentage. So the identification, reporting, monitoring, and strengthening of OECMs recognizes the contribution made to biodiversity conservation by sites managed for a variety of purposes, which was actually mentioned by Francois previously. So governing authorities can include governments, indigenous peoples, local communities, women or other right holders, private entities, civil society, or a combination of any one of these stakeholders. And the key is good governance is always essential for effective and equitable conservation, including in protected areas and OECMs as well. So the key principles of good governance are participation and also transparency. So this is very important if you are going to establish an OECM. So, of course, you know, when we look into the data sources, gaps and uncertainties, at the moment, we know that OECMs are just getting into the scene, and we know that there are many questions, but we know that it is actually a way of reaching some of the targets, the Target 3. So we know that, you know, it is important to have the overall knowledge, and we also to know what are the gaps and some of the uncertainties as well. So to apply the criteria of the site level identification tool, you will need the information about the site's biodiversity, management, threats, legal status, and other key information as well. So you need to have data collection for this process. And so data collection is likely to involve a mixture of methods to ensure thoroughness and reliability. And in terms of the assessments, in applying the site level tool, advisors, evaluators will be required to make a science-based and objective assessment using the best available data and information available. So OECM identification is usually led by the site's governing authority or by another entity with the authority's consent, as well as with the consent of any indigenous peoples and local communities if they are not the governing authority but have a claim to the site. So it's really important, as you see, that you will be hearing indigenous peoples and local communities over and over when it comes to OECMs. So it is very important to include all the key stakeholders, especially at the local level, when identifying and establishing an OECM. So the application of the OECM framework is site and context specific, and therefore special considerations apply across various governance types and biomes. So we all know that, of course, this is a global level application, but we know that Mediterranean is different than the Pacific. Pacific is different than the Atlantic. So we know that also when we look into the Mediterranean, we are 20 plus countries. So in each country at the national level, the contexts are different. So we really have to ensure that the applications are there on to the point at the national level and at the regional level as well. So of course, when an OECM is identified, of course, the OECM has to be reported into certain databases to be considered and established as an OECM. So there are two databases, and we can say that they're the two legacy data sets, which is the World Database on Protected Areas and the World Database on OECMs. So these data sets actually recently have been merged into a single global data set called the World Database on Protected and Conserved Areas, in short WDPCA, to streamline monitoring and reporting OECMs and of course protected areas as well. So once a site is established and once a site is actually has gone through, let's say once a site is gone through the full assessment and once a site is confirmed that it will be reported as an OECM by the stakeholders, that it is reported actually to these databases, which is actually managed and coordinated by UNEP WCMC, which is UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Center, with the support of IUCN WCP, which is IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas. And these are all legal entities responsible for evaluating the reported OECMs under CBD. And also when we reflect into the Mediterranean, now we're talking about the Mediterranean, we know that Mediterranean countries should also report their confirmed OECMs to the base of marine protected areas in the Mediterranean, which is MAPAMET, which I initially showed the map of the Mediterranean from MAPAMET. And this MAPAMET is actually managed by UNEP-MAP SPARAG and MEDPAN, the network of marine protected areas of managers in the Mediterranean. So this database in the Mediterranean, the MAPAMET, is a further official source of data for WDPCA and for CBD in relation to Target 3, just to ensure alignment between regional and global reporting. So unless an OECM is reported to WPCA, it will not be included in the relevant global indicators for Target 3 of the GBF. So you can maybe establish and declare an OECM at the national level, but then it has to go into these data sets and has to be approved in order to count towards the 30 by 30 Target 3 goals. So when it comes to reporting and monitoring, a key element of OECM definition, as mentioned by François, is that they should be governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for the in situ conservation of biodiversity. So we know that there are many available guidance on monitoring and indicators for OECMs and protected areas. So there are many tools and many guidelines and many publications about sources of data for inventory and monitoring, and also about area-based assessment tools, which are available online in different websites. So it's really important that, you know, streamlining these data sets is very important. So there are also other set of tools, which is like the Global Database on Protected Area Management Effectiveness. We call them as the PAMA tools. They are actually being redesigned and they will be incorporated into WDPCA for further centralization monitoring of both area and effectiveness for the protected areas and OECMs. So when it comes to the monitoring of OECMs, we definitely need the support of these tools and guidances, but we also need to take into considerations that these tools have different purposes, benefits, and also limitations. So an OECM's governing authority will need to assess which one is appropriate and should be adapted if needed based on the context of the OECM. But as we say, there are many different tools, there are many different monitoring methods. They're all available, and based upon the OECM's need, you can definitely select the one that fits into your OECM or the declared OECM. Of course, you know, there are responsibilities that comes with the OECMs, especially for the monitoring, because as we said, they have to be long-term. So when a site is reported as an OECM, it should be clear who's responsible for ensuring that ongoing monitoring is conducted to ensure the maintenance of the biodiversity and social values initially identified. So reporting a site as an OECM carries the responsibility of monitoring the biodiversity for which the site is considered important. The organization or entity responsible for monitoring should ensure that monitoring data are retained, are publicly available, and that summary results are reported. So there should be regular updates. So the WDPCA is updated monthly. So the map that I recently showed is actually January 2026. And with new and revised data from providers incorporated on a rolling schedule to reflect additions, changes in boundaries, and status modifications. So as you see that sometimes OECMs initially maybe can be perceived as an easy way to reach the global targets, but no, they're not. They are actually maybe not as, you know, same as protected areas, but their goal is actually to protect biodiversity. So they actually have to be monitored. They actually have to be managed. So it's very important to do these updates and monitoring regularly when an OECM is actually established. So just, you know, reflecting back to this maps again. So we know that OECMs in the end actually have to be reflected in these protected planet maps to be considered towards the Target 3 30 by 30 goals. And so this is sort of like the process, how these maps are created. Of course, there are many detailed information in each and every step that I mentioned, but of course we have limited time here. So I just want to reflect on the brief general framework about how to identify, establish, report, and monitor OECMs. Especially, it is important for the Mediterranean because at the moment there are no marine OECMs. Yes, some are in the way, but we're not there yet. But just to reflect from the perspective of IUCN, especially for OECMs, IUCN is always here to give any support in terms of technical support, because we know that OECM process is very important, especially for the marine OECMs in the Mediterranean. Like with many other organizations, we are here to give the technical support to relevant stakeholders when needed. So depending on which region you are in the Mediterranean or outside the Mediterranean, you can definitely reach out to relevant IUCN offices. And as mentioned, there are many available publications, tools, and guidance on websites of IUCN and other organizations that definitely can be quite useful to have a deeper understanding of the OECM. So, well, all from my side. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yaprak. Thank you for explaining the really clear role of IUCN to help everyone navigate in the different tools and guidance. If you still have questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A, and we will continue with the presentations. Asma, it's going to be your turn to continue. And while you present your screen, know that you can also vote on some of the questions that you can see in the Q&A section and comment them if needed, if you want to add something or if you're also interested. Asma, I'll leave it up to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Margot, and thank you also for François and Yaprak for setting the scene. If you allow me, I will start by giving the context of the OECM guidance that the SPARAC is developing, and which aim is to support in the identification and the application of the criteria, the CBD criteria in the Mediterranean context. And maybe before that, for participants that are joining maybe for first time and hearing about the SPARAC for the first time, the SPARAC is the Specially Protected Area Regional Activity Center operating under the Barcelona Convention. The Barcelona Convention is one of the UNEP regional sea conventions, that its mission is to support the conservation in the Mediterranean Sea. And the SPARAC is in charge of the application of the Specially Protected Area and Biological Diversity Protocol, one of the 7 protocols of the Barcelona Convention at the Mediterranean level. And so our top priority for the recent years and the coming ones is to support in the application and implementation and also reaching the CBD, the GBF CBD target 3, which is the 30 by 30 that stipulates that there is a need and an objective, a global objective, but also a regional objective to reach the 30% of protection of our Mediterranean Sea through MPAs, through MCPAs, protected coastal and marine areas, but also through the OECMs. So for that, the SPARAC has developed, or let's say more updated in this in the recent years, it's a post-2020 strategic action program for the conservation of biodiversity, known as the post-2020 SABBIO, which is an umbrella for all the work and the commitments and objectives of the SPARAC under which is operating and targeting actions and interventions in the contracting parties, in the countries, in collaboration, of course, with its partners. And one of the objectives of the SABBIO is, of course, dedicated to MPAs and OECMs. And for that, we have developed a specific strategic document, which is also adopted by the Barcelona Convention COP 2020 in 2021. This regional strategy which is the regional strategy for MCPAs and OECMs, also is fully aligned to the 30 by 30 target, to the global 30 by 30 target, which is protection of 30% of the Mediterranean by 2030, but also that the number of coverage of those MCPAs with enhanced protection is increased. So to just a quick, really super quick focus on this strategy, it has 5 main pillars: one for the governance of MCPAs and OECMs, one for the MCPA coverage that needs to be increased, one for marine and coastal OECMs, so a specific strategic pillar on OECMs with different actions at regional and national levels. Another one for MCPA management effectiveness, and the last one on action and support to MCPA and OECM. So as you can see, OECMs are one of the core priorities for the SPARAC through this MCPA and OECM strategy. And for that, we have been supported by our precious ad hoc group of experts for MPAs in the Mediterranean, known as the IGEM, that was set up by Barcelona Convention decision, and it provides strategic and technical guidance to us in order to support the countries in an effective manner on the issues of MPAs and OECM. And through and with the support of this volunteer group, which is composed of volunteer experts, but also with the main and key regional organizations in the region, we have developed this MCPA and OECM strategy, its evaluation and monitoring framework, but also the OECM guidance that we are going to present to you today. And specifically, it will be presented by my colleague Sue Wells, who supported us in its drafting, enhancement, and also finalization. So about this OECM guidance, it was developed to contribute to the understanding of the OECM concept, because as it was said earlier by Francois, its definition, the OECM definition, came only in 2018, and it's still, I think, a blurry concept, which justifies the several webinars and the several actions that are put in place by the different partners in order to, and the organizations, in order to support in the clarification of this concept, but also its application, because now in 2016, it is time to really move concretely, specifically that we have seen with YAPRAC that no marine OECMs in the Mediterranean are reported until this moment. And this guidance, it supports the Mediterranean country in the identification, recognition, and the reporting. So it really covers all the steps needed that leads to the reporting of the OECMs. It is, of course, aligned to the CBD OECM framework of the 30 by 30 target. And it clarifies the complementarity also between MPAs and OECMs, because sometimes it's not so, this distinction is not really so evident, it's not so clear. So it provides for that some examples and some guidance on that. It is tailored to the Mediterranean context, and it provides a step-by-step approach to identify and to report OECMs. And this guidance was reviewed by our SPABD, our Specially Protected Area and Biological Diversity focal points, which are representative of the Mediterranean countries, and also closely monitored and reviewed by our MPA group, which is the IGEM. We have, after some steps in developing this guidance, we have tried a pilot testing phase with 3 volunteer countries, 3 Mediterranean volunteer countries, which are Morocco, Libya, and Lebanon, and during which we have, of course, tried to to further clarify the OECM concept, but also going step by step with some proposed sites to be seen as a candidate OECM or no. So it was a very fruitful experience, and we would like, of course, to thank these countries, but also we know that several other countries are also interested, which allowed us to fine-tune our guidance in order to finalize. So finally, what I would like to say that OECMs are really key opportunities. So let's remember we are 4 years before the milestone, the CBD milestone of the 2030 targets, and OECMs, I think they will be the main savior for our Mediterranean in order to reach or to contribute to reaching the 30 by 30 target. The guidance that will be presented in more details by Sue following my presentation, it provides a practical and robust framework to the Mediterranean countries to move from the concept, from the identification until reporting. And also I would like to share with you that when we are going to finalize, it's almost in its very final step, the SPIRAC will hold a specific webinar to disseminate this guidance and also to further work with the stakeholders on the way forward. Collaboration and coherence with countries, but also with international, regional, and also national organizations, our partners, are essential to the OECM recognition in the region. And in the coming years, as I said, they are really critical to translate the commitments that the countries did into actions and deliver measurable biodiversity outcomes by 2030. So I think that's all from me. It's just setting the scene of this OECM guidance. And Margot, I think now we can invite you to share a presentation on this guidance. And of course, once it will be finalized, it will be publicly disseminated and also translated into French. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asma. Thank you for your effort in making these OECMs more practical. Sue, it's now your turn to continue on these guidance documents. And thank you also. There are already a lot of questions that are being answered in the Q&A section. You can continue and we will come back on some of them and the new ones. The floor is yours, Sue.
Thanks very much, Margot. That's great. And thanks very much to the previous presenters, because I really don't have to do very much. You've presented all the difficult bits about this, because I think, as Francois made very clear, although the idea of an OECM has been around now for quite a long time, it really is a very new thing in that people have been struggling, as I think Francois made it very clear. The definition isn't entirely clear. You really do need to understand it. And people are actually finding it quite difficult to do the process. I think initially it was the thinking that we could very quickly identify OECMs all over the place and help countries reach the targets. But this requirement for and it's a real genuine need to have this criteria and requirement for meeting effective conservation and having a successful biodiversity outcome. Of course, we know how difficult that is for protected areas, and so it's just as difficult for OECMs to actually demonstrate that. So it is quite a challenge. Wait a moment. I've got a problem. Yes. Okay, that does move on. Sorry about that. So as Asma explained, the purpose of the guidance is to help sort of interpret the existing guidance for the Mediterranean to help identify and report on OECMs in the marine and coastal environment. And so it covers terrestrial areas that are defined as being coastal. And the Barcelona Convention explains their habitats and ecosystems that are covered in that way. And this webinar today, we're primarily going to focus on marine. The other thing it does, what we decided initially was that it really was important for people to be able to understand how much guidance has come out. There's far more guidance, and there are examples of successful OECMs, I'm afraid. I've noticed the requests for examples of those in the chat. There's lots of guidance for different types of OECM, and I think there's probably more being produced at the moment. So this Mediterranean guidance is in many ways a sort of state of the situation in January 2026, because the actual process for doing this and providing guidance is a work in progress, and there will definitely be more guidance to come. And we really wanted to make it, as Asma said, a sort of helpful document. And I think Sparek's idea of having the pilot testing with the 3 countries was really useful for us, because it threw up quite a lot of the problems that people are having. Asma's presented the contents. I just quickly wanted to run through it, and because a lot of the content has been presented by Yaprak and Francois. So background to OECMs, that really summarizes what Francois told us, the origin of the concept and the CBD criteria, and generally how and why OECMs came into being. We've then got a section on all the recognized guidance now, the important guidance that there is for reporting and identifying OECMs, and I'll mention that in the next slide in a bit more detail. Section 3 is a focus on designing a national process. That's available. Guidance on that is available in many of the sets of guidance that we've mentioned. But in the course of developing this, we realized that that was a component of the process that's often overlooked. And it is really important to have some kind of national understanding of how countries are going to identify their OECMs. It's not essential, because when the guidance, IUCN WCPA's guidance was first produced, the thinking was rather that if you produce guidance just where a site could identify itself, as it were, with the management authorities, you can do it site by site, but that actually makes it quite complicated, because obviously if you've got, for example, archaeology sites that have a biodiversity conservation benefit, and if you do them one at a time with different groups of people, you may end up with a rather different set of places. You may not share information that would be more useful. It will be difficult for reporting. So the strong recommendation now is to actually design a national process. Then section 4 is the main guidance. And as we've mentioned, we really are strongly recommending to countries that they use the basic IUCN guidance, the site assessment tool, and Yaprak took us through that. And then the idea is that you use that as your basic step-by-step guide to the process, and then you bring in the other more detailed guidance for specific types of sites as and when needed. Section 5, brief discussion of what types of area might be suitable for OECM assessment, and Francois provided a list of those earlier on, and I saw there were some questions in the chat. We might want to discuss that later on. Now, this webinar specifically on marine, and marine very quickly became apparent that identifying marine OECMs was going to be probably more difficult than terrestrial ones, for exactly the same reason that managing marine protected areas effectively to achieve biodiversity conservation outcomes can be a lot more difficult than doing so in a terrestrial situation. As you all know, data is more difficult to collect in the marine environment. You're dealing with a three-dimensional system. We ourselves, as human beings, doing the management and having the impacts, we're terrestrial beings, and so our knowledge, although it's increasing very, very rapidly, is not as good as for the terrestrial situation. So I'll quickly discuss some of the points about that. And then, because the question of how you report a confirmed OECM, which is covered in the guidance, but it's been evolving since the guidance was first produced, we've put a full section on that, because in the course of preparing the guidance, we got an enormous amount of questions about this. The two annexes, both of which really are not what I would call completed pieces of work, and they're not going to be, because it's all evolving as we speak. One, progress in identifying OECMs in the Mediterranean. And I think probably when we started this process, we were hoping we'd have an example of an OECM, at least in the marine environment, but we don't. So we've just got a general update of what's happening in some of the countries, but it's not the result of a full survey or review of every country. It's just some examples. And then we also thought it useful to include some examples of national guidance and processes developed in different countries. And it's great that we've got countries from outside the Mediterranean here today too, because you may be able to contribute to this. So the existing guidance for identifying marine OECMs, as we've mentioned, the primary source is the IUCN site assessment tool, and then the 2024 detailed guidance. And I really do recommend that you look at that. It's got lots of case studies, and it goes into a lot more explanation of each of the steps. FAO that's now published its guide for identifying potential fisheries-based OECMs. And there are two documents, in fact, in the guidance that they're both mentioned. An initial one that runs through the process. Essentially, it's based on the IUCN site assessment tool. It does give you slightly different layout, but that's why my recommendation anyway is to stick with the IUCN site assessment tool, as it's what everybody on the whole is using. But the FAO guidance is really important because it explains to you how to take into account the different types of fishery management areas and what they might mean and how they might be interpreted as potential OECMs or not. Perhaps that's the important thing to think. That raised almost immediately, when it was published, a lot of further questions on how you can assess the potential biodiversity outcome of a fishery management area, management area of any kind. And any of you with a marine background will know that that's discussed enormously. So they've tried to pull together the various techniques and technologies that can be used now for looking at how an area managed for fishery, for extraction of a resource, might also have a biodiversity benefit. What kind of monitoring you'd need to do, what kind of data you would need, when and where you could use what are called proxy studies. So that's places in similar locations that are demonstrating success. The GFCM, the main Mediterranean regional fisheries body, has also been looking at this and has looked at the potential for Mediterranean fisheries-based OECMs, and held a meeting in 2022, and the report of that gives some very useful guidance. And there's work underway to produce what's going to be called the Marine OECM Guide, to be produced by Oregon State University. It's not publicly available yet. It's being published as a scientific paper. I think we've got at least one person on this call who works with the group and may be able to talk more about that and when it will be available. And the interesting thing about this is it looks at all marine sectors, not just fisheries. Then we have BirdLife has produced a very quick position paper on marine OECMs. It's very useful. It looks at wind farms, oil and gas sector, shipping, etc., and just gives you a quick idea of what to look at in terms of spatially managed areas within those sectors and whether or not it might be worth seeing if they initially might meet the criteria of a candidate marine OECM. And then in the guidance, we've also just listed some of the nationally adapted guidance. A lot of countries are producing their own guidance using the IUCN guidance tool, but adapting it to make sure it suits their own national legislation and policies on conservation areas. And as most of you probably know, there's an enormous number of scientific papers about OECMs coming out almost every month at the moment. So we've summarized some of the key ones. I thought it was just worth going through the national process because many of us think that this is a very good way to start, and many countries are now starting. For example, when we did the Lebanon pilot testing, we learned that they've actually started a national process now. So the initial process, the initial recommendation is that the key agencies, NGOs, whatever it might be, people interested in this, get together and think about why they're doing this. In many countries, or many people are sort of thinking about it primarily in the context of meeting target 3. But of course, just meeting target 3 isn't in and of itself going to achieve conservation. And the much more fundamental reasons for identifying OECMs, and Francois and Yaprak referred to this, is that it provides an incentive to look at how different sectors are managing their activities and whether or not that management could be improved to improve biodiversity conservation. And the other very useful thing about the OECM concept is it's good to go back to any assessments of the whole network that countries might have, marine and coastal protected areas and terrestrial, of course, to see what the gaps are. Many countries, a decade or two ago, did big national assessments of their protected areas and the gaps, and OECMs may well provide a tool for filling in those gaps. Another key thing to do is to think about whether there are two ways really to look at this across a country. One is, are you looking sector by sector, so fisheries, wind farms, tourism, historic sites, or are you going to look at the gaps in your network of marine and coastal protected areas and see across the board if you want to do it? And in that case, it might be more of a site-specific basis, or you're going to do some kind of combination of the two. So that sort of straight away leads into thinking about, how are we as a country actually going to be doing this? Do we need some national guidance? Can we ideally make use of the existing guidance that we have? And most importantly, who's actually going to fund the process? Will the NGOs, how will NGOs be involved? Where will the government play a role? Government's often short-staffed for this kind of activity. What other experts are needed? And then, of course, that leads on to exactly who is going to be involved, what expertise is needed. Have you got the relevant universities, research institutes, data gathering institutions, the NGOs, and most importantly, the local stakeholders across the different sectors and including local communities. So it's quite a big process. A lot of it it makes it sound it's a whole new thing to be done. I think that's why governments are struggling with it. But actually, a lot of it is ongoing work and can be linked into existing work that's been done, existing initiatives that are underway that might well be funded already. And then the next step from there, once you've got the general outline of what the country is going to do, then you can start to draw up a list of potential OECMs for screening, and you run through the whole process that was explained at the site assessment tool. That's very helpful. So I think somebody mentioned that there has been some progress in looking at Mediterranean marine sites. As far as I know, there are one or two national ones, and maybe people on this call may want to talk about that. I thought I would just mention this regional one with the GFCM. They held this expert meeting in Rome in 2022 to do an initial screening of 8 fishery management areas. And they look particularly at fishery regulation areas, which have strict controls, as I'm sure most of you know, and that are the most likely fisheries management areas to meet the criteria for an OECM. And so on the left-hand column, you've got the places, and then there were 8 sites listed in the middle, and then just a very brief summary of the conclusion of that initial assessment. Sorry, I forgot to put in the conclusion for the Italy-Croatia one, which was that it should go ahead. It would be useful to do a full assessment. This was emphasized again, this was an initial screening, just going through step 1 on the site assessment tool, just the first 4 questions. Is it a protected area already? Has it got management? Has it got defined boundaries, etc.? Okay, so it's not the full assessment. And they identified quite quickly that for some of these sites, they needed a lot more information on the conservation values of the area, the monitoring that was underway, whether positive biodiversity outcomes were being achieved. But it's really worth looking at that report to get an understanding of how you might start to identify a marine OECM. And here, the Velebit Channel in Croatia, this was the results of their very first questions that they looked at. I won't go through it all in detail, but you can see geographically defined space, yes, recognized as a protected area, no. And then, you know, what you do, there is an overlap, but nevertheless, there's an area that's not covered, who's the governance authority. And then this big question is, does it contribute to in situ biodiversity conservation? In this case, there was sufficient information to show that it almost certainly does. The threats were known, and there were many, but there is monitoring. So you're kind of close to all the criteria for effective management for those who know about protected area management. So then the requirement is that it actually needs to move on to not only step 2, which is where you get consent of all those involved, but also step 3, where you do the really detailed assessment laid out in the IUCN tool. So thanks to the GFCM colleagues on this call, I had a quick email exchange with them before we had this webinar, because I was intrigued as to why the process didn't seem to have moved forward from 2022. And they pointed out, of course, that there are some constraints to it. I want to emphasize again, for OECMs, it's the countries that are lead on this process. I mean, both Yaprak and Francois made that very clear. It's the countries who undertake the process to identify their OECMs. But in many cases, for fisheries and other marine spatially managed areas, are often shared between countries, or they're in international waters. So that means there's a sort of added layer of consultation needed. In the case of the GFCM, countries may decide to say to the GFCM, we want to do it with you, through you. And perhaps we can have more of a discussion in that with the GFCM representatives, because I'm not entirely familiar with the process, and it is new anyway, and we still don't actually have an marine OECM going forward. So for marine, it's a kind of small inshore marine OECM, probably could be done fairly straightforwardly. We had a very nice example from Libya, hope they might take it forward, of an archaeological site on the coast, which is protecting biodiversity as a result of the regulations on access, etc., coastal biodiversity. But there's also potential for having a community managed fisheries area off it. It was a really interesting example. It would need a bit more work because not all management is in place on the marine side, but it was a great example. Another one was in Lebanon, where there's a community area, community managed area protecting the beach. And again, question as to whether that could be extended into the marine environment. So there are examples where countries can start to identify marine OECMs, but for the bigger, more offshore areas are often going to be looking at some kind of process involving regional bodies or neighbouring countries, some kind of bilateral agreements. Lots of questions about existing examples, and I saw that I know we've got a representative from Canada here. I think we've got South Africa here. As we've mentioned over again, there are not many marine OECMs. I think it was a suggestion you can look on the World Database of Protected and Conserved Areas to see what OECMs exist. I'm afraid that's a risky thing to do because although a lot of are listed there, a lot were listed very early on after the OECM definition was brought out and without a full understanding of the criteria. So to say that they're successful, I think is probably jumping the gun. Canada, though, has had a very long-standing process. I've put that their national OECM guidance was developed in 2022, but they actually started a long time before. They've done a sort of national process that is now has been reflected in the guidance on how to do a national process. And they've produced their own national guiding principles, etc. And in the case of fisheries-based ones, I know that they've reported most of their marine refuges. It's a particular national categorization of fishery management area in Canada. Most of those are now reported as OECMs. And there are several historic sites of recent shipwrecks and things like that have recently been reported. I put over 40, and I'm probably, so I have no idea how many it is now, but hopefully if the representatives from Canada are still on the call, they can update us on that. So I know South Africa has a good process. If I'd had more time, I would put something up about their work. So maybe the South Africans on the call might want to talk about that. I think I just ended that there. I hope that's just given you some ideas, and I didn't want to speak more because I think the questions are really important to discuss and answer. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you for sharing this last bit of the presentations. Yes, there's some applause coming in, and I think it's worth it. Thank you to all of our speakers for this presentation. That was already very insightful. We have a little bit less time on the Q&A than I hoped, but fortunately there were already a lot of questions in the Q&A sections that were at least partially answered. So we will start again maybe with those that were not answered yet, and maybe come back to some others that had partial responses. So there's a first question, short one: is it possible for OECMs to have buffers areas? I don't know if any of you four has a thought about that.
Right. Well, I'll make an initial response. I mean, it wouldn't be the buffer area for the site is is an OECM. If the buffer area meets the criteria for the OECM, it would be part of the OECM. I think what's interesting with OECMs is that some protected areas have buffer areas which are not considered part of the protected area and therefore not reported on when the boundaries of the protected area are submitted to the WDCPA, or that are not considered, they're buffer areas, but they're not considered protected areas. This is, it's particularly relevant for biosphere reserves. And in that case, if the area within the buffer zone, within the boundaries of the buffer zone, meets all the criteria and is achieving the conservation benefit that's expected, then that could be counted as an OECM. And then you'd have the core zone, core protected area, and as the protected area, and the surrounding buffer zone would be the OECM. And this is also being looked at a lot for Ramsar sites. Ramsar's produced its own guidance and are strongly recommending that people look at what they're doing in surrounding areas of the designated site, as they may be able to incorporate some of the areas recognize some of the areas as an OECM, the buffer areas.
Thank you very much. So I think it's answered the question. I hope it answered the question. I wanted also to come back to one of the first questions that was asked, on which also Sue, you already added a first response. That's a question from Romain Renou, saying that at the end of the day, is asking who is in charge to officially check if all the OECM criteria are met. So you already started. I don't know if you want to provide a little bit more details. As you said, it was worth a discussion.
Yeah, I was just I'm wondering if there's anybody else on the call who might be able to add more to this. But with the World Database on Protected and Conserved Areas, as Yaprak has explained, they're putting the two together, and this has led to a big review of the data. And there has, as many of you probably know, a lot of concern, because if you go sort of randomly into the database and look at a site, it often has not exactly the correct information, particularly if it's a site you know well. And this is all to do with historical reporting of the database. UNEP CMC, which maintains the database, their role is to take data submitted by governments and put it on the database. They can't actually challenge a government. They don't have that power. It's not their mandate. So a lot of stuff there may have been reported historically with not very good understanding of what was required. Everybody recognizes it sort of needs a bit of cleaning out, and that sort of led to the whole question, well, who does verify this? In the case of marine protected areas, it's quite interesting, because some of you may know MPA Atlas, which is a parallel database maintained separately. And the organization that runs that does do a verification check of the data. So the data in that about marine protected areas is a lot more likely to be more accurate, but it may not necessarily be what the government would like to report. We all understand the differences there. So for OECMs, it's sort of somehow doubly difficult, because who's going to verify that at the moment? There's nobody with that possibility of doing that. What they're wanting to do with the database, and they may have already, this is where the database, the WDCPA is evolving so quickly, it may already be there, the fields to fill in when you report an OECM, to actually report what, when, where, and who did the assessment, and ideally some of the results of the assessment for the OECM. Because then if that's reported and is openly available, just by itself, it provides a form of verification, and people can challenge it if they think for any reason it's not appropriate. I'm not sure if that has gone live. I think they're going to trying to have just 4 fairly simple questions, but we can provide more information on that. I can get in touch with the people doing this. So it's a difficult question. There isn't, yeah. There's no, the CBD Secretariat doesn't verify it. UNEP WCMC doesn't verify it. It's
Maybe I can add into what Sue just mentioned, because there was actually this discussion at IUCN Congress in Abu Dhabi this year. We actually had the chance to have a conversation with some representatives from WCMC and also with IUCN CPA's Protected Planet Specialist Group. So they are actually planning on establishing this task force, which could definitely be the task force that can actually really follow up with the OECMs, with all these, approvals, establishment, monitoring, acceptance, and such. So this is actually one of the key questions. So there is actually many ongoing discussions on this. So there will be actually eventually a mechanism, a more concrete mechanism on this, so to say, based on the preliminary discussions. So, yeah.
Any other thoughts to continue the discussion on that? Thank you very much, Sue and Yaprak, for this answer. There's another question in the Q&A that hasn't been answered yet from Sana Tak. How can an NGO help us secure free, prior, and informed consent before our land is reported as an OECM to the world database? So I don't know if you understand the sense of this question. And if anyone has a start of an answer, maybe Sana, you can provide a little bit more.
That's what I was going to ask. If there could be a bit of more background information, it would be a lot easier to respond to the question. From which perspective the help or support is needed. So,
Yes, Sana, I will ask you to turn on your microphone. I have sent you normally you can speak now.
Yes, thank you. We know that all the institutions, government having a big role to evaluate, to monitor this OECM. But I think that NGO working on the field have also a good role to do. But how we can do it with the other stakeholders, how we can be involved and engaged more so we can help, especially in national level. Because in all the tools that we see in guidelines, we didn't see this, how we can implement these guidelines or these tools as NGOs. Maybe the other stakeholders can understand more, but I think that we have a good role to do in this process. Thank you.
Maybe I can give the initial response and, my colleagues can complement. So as actually mentioned during my presentation, so actually the second step of the identification OECMs is the key step of involving all the stakeholder groups, local communities. Of course, NGOs, CSOs are within these local communities, indigenous peoples. So when there is actually the identification process of an OECM, all the relevant stakeholders within the vicinity and within the, let's say the geographical scope or relevant, stakeholders has to be involved. And of course, this can come from the bottom-up approach as well. If an NGO, based on their assessments, based on their projects, or based on the current work that they are doing on a site, if they think that, the site that they're working can be considered as a potential OECM, they definitely can approach to the relevant authorities to go with the authorities and other relevant stakeholders, of course, to see that if this site can be assessed and then, could be considered as a potential OECM. So it can come, from the governmental side, or it can come from, the local, communities, including NGOs and CSOs. And of course, also, as I mentioned, there are many available tools out there as well. to support with this assessment part or to support with the stakeholder engagement part. They're all available online. We can try to find like some specific maybe tools or methodologies to involve the relevant stakeholder, not just authorities, but other relevant stakeholders. But as I highlighted during my presentation, the involvement of the stakeholders, local communities, and indigenous peoples where, you know, possible is the key for OECMs. Actually, this is how more or less the whole OECM concept evolved, so to say. So yeah, that's from my side. So I'm sure my colleagues may have more to complement.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any compliments that some of you want to bring to what Yaprak already added?
Just maybe to say that even in the OECM expert network, there are still some questions that we are still asking to each other because the process is not really very, very extremely clear. So that sometimes we come back to each other, to the IUCN, OECM task force, the people in the CBD, etc., in order to have more responses, and also maybe to add on what was already said by Yaprak and by Sue, as it was said. So there are two types of data providers, or the people that can submit a dossier and candidate OECM to the CBD. One is the government itself, and the other could be the private sector, NGOs, etc. So NGOs, they have also a key role in this process. However, the verification, I think, of those data in this step, it depends. If you are government, I think your data is directly considered as verified and is more or less automatically added to the OECM. But I think what Yaprak said after the Abu Dhabi conference, I think maybe another step will be added. And in the second case, data that are provided by non-governmental bodies, these data should be verified by state verifiers or expert verifiers. So it's very clear in this second scenario, and then it could be added to the OECM. So the formatting and the data quality and the dossier should be, of course, be checked before the area is automatically added to the database.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, there are a lot of questions about reporting, but I think the first thing is to make sure that you actually know how to identify a site. Once a site is identified, then you can look at how it will be reported, because how it will be reported will depend on who is involved in identifying it and the outcome of the assessment. So the assessment is the key thing. There are very clear reporting mechanisms in place, may not be so clearly explained, but the point is that what's really important is to do the assessment, and then you will easily find out how to report it in any particular situation. And yes, if the whole process is NGO-led, but you must have the relevant authorities' involvement in the process. But if it is NGO-led, you're able to report it as an NGO OECM.
Thank you very much. Many responses finally for this question. Thank you, Sana, for asking it. We have new questions coming in. One again from Romain Renou on the risks of OECM. Is there a risk that government will be more willing to create OECMs rather than MPAs? Can there be competition between both? I don't know who has something to say.
I can try to answer this one. Hi, Romain. Salut. Yeah, that's a good question, and indeed, it's questions that deserve some thinking. I always myself ask this question because But what would be the value for a government not to declare a PA and to declare an OECM? I mean, I put the question at the upside down. Is that a matter of cost? And if it's a matter of cost, it would be probably the same cost, because an OECM has to be managed, has to be monitored, and has to deliver anyway. As I put in the chat, the only difference is that the cost will not rely on the same institution, probably. So if a government wants to have the fisheries ministry paying for conservation, you can declare OECMs, and the fisheries ministry will pay for it, and not the environment ministry. But otherwise, I frankly don't see much value of trying to put an OECM if you can do an MPA. If the purpose of your site is not to deliver conservation, but it does deliver conservation, then yes, you can put an OECMs for example, you need a wind farm, and from the beginning you can conceive your wind farm area as an OECM, and you can put in the wind farm planning all the conservation measures together. In this case, yes, you can try to put an OECM better than an MPA, because an MPA will not allow to have wind farm in it. But otherwise, if your primary conservation objective is, the primary objective is conservation, go for an MPA or for a PA, not for an OECM. If it's a secondary objective, or ancillary objective is then another subject. But if it's a secondary objective, yes, go for an OECM. But it's for me, it's the only case where a government should really go for an OECM better than an MPA.
Yes, Esma, go ahead if you want to complement that.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a tricky question, but also what you just said, Francois, is I think the answer is pretty simple. What would be the added value of declaring a site that its primary objective is conservation to be declared as OECM? The answer is simple: is to reach the target, is to reach the numbers, because countries have the commitments and have this CBD GBF 30 by 30 target, and they have the Barcelona Convention 30 by 30 target. So it's rushing towards achieving those targets. But then also, I think it's a case by case option, because for example, for the southern Mediterranean countries, we know that there are many sites that are future MPAs for more than decades or even 2 decades, and that they have never ever been declared as such. So this for them could be a solution to temporarily declare the site as OECM until all the papers are ready and to be declared as MPAs. But I know very well that the OECM expert network, IUCN task force on OECMs, etc., do not recommend this, because it's a shortcut. It's just to get an answer to a question, and we will see what we will have later. But unfortunately, or I don't know, maybe fortunately also for them, it's one of the options that are considered. And we have also encountered some countries that they seriously think about that, about declaring some future MPAs as OECM. So this is the reality of the things as well.
Thank you for these complementary answers. Thank you, Romain, for the question. There's a lot of questions that are already been answered and none that's still pending. So we can maybe, while others maybe are typing, come back to one of the questions that was asked by Eve Bourdon on the question whether there's a place where all existing efficiency measurement tools are listed with a comparison of what each one does. Sue, you answered already to the question, and I think you provided also some answers during your presentation, but you might want to come back on that.
Yes, this is where a sort of one-stop shop, I take it, for all these tools, and we haven't really got that yet. You could get quite a lot of information about the tools on the Protected Planet database, the sort of explanatory pages for the World protect WD, sorry, well, WDPCA as it's now called, and they do list some of the management effectiveness tools. One thing that is only now starting to be realized is that a lot of the tools that have been designed for assessing the effectiveness and conservation outcomes of protected areas themselves could actually be used for helping to identify OECMs on a site. But that we haven't yet sort of translated the one to the other, and at the moment they're all referred to as protected area management effectiveness tools and guidance. The one thing that's often forgotten is that the green list, IUCN green list itself, is for protected and conserved areas, and so that framework and criteria, if a site meets that, that will also, but is not managed with the primary objective of conservation, you could also use that for assessing your OECM. So we are trying, there's an initiative with the Conservation Standards program in the States is doing, trying to put together a framework of all the different tools. I'm not quite sure how that's going to be published or where or made available. We did about 2 years ago at the Impact 5 in Vancouver, the International Marine Protected Areas Congress. Some of us held a workshop and we finally published a paper from that, which lists a number of the management effectiveness assessment tools. So although it's not specifically on OECM, it provides a list of the tools. And so I'm not being fast enough to put links in the chat, but it's mentioned in the guidance itself, so you can get the reference to it and I can provide copies of it. And we're now looking to try and find a platform, presumably it would be on the WCPA Marine web pages somewhere, to put a listing of all the tools so that people can actually go and see what would be useful for OECMs, what would be useful for protected area assessments, etc. Because all these things overlap and they all, in their different ways, contribute to Target 3, helping countries meet Target 3. But it's moving so fast at the moment that we're not keeping up very well with the cataloguing of it all.
Thank you very much, Sue. And if I may, on the links and different documents, as we stated at the beginning, there will be also a summary of this webinar that will be sent afterwards together with the recording. And we will do our best to summarize also all the tools that were being mentioned here by the speakers, also in the chat and on the Q&As. There are also some additional links that were shared, so we'll do our best to do something a bit coherent. If not exhaustive, that's not going to be the case, but as complete as possible. I don't see any more questions now. Maybe if there is 2 minutes just to come back on some fisheries restricted areas and fisheries managed areas, because there were some questions in the chat and there were already plenty of responses. But maybe if one of you want to clarify a little bit these and how they can qualify as OECMs, I think that will be helpful, as I could see that it could be confusing for some people in the Q&A.
Yeah, happy to try to answer this one. It's a complicated one, but I've been following the FRA situation for many years, and I always said that they should qualify really for OECMs. They are really good candidates. Having said that, it remains some issues with that. I mean, there are a couple of issues. The first is the objective. A fisheries restricted area is as per for objective biodiversity conservation. I mean, it's pretty clear. So on this, it has maybe to be clarified again, but even it's for fisheries, but in some cases, it's really for, because fisheries, why an FRA is created is because fisheries is having an impact on biodiversity, that it decided not to fish in this area. So it has clearly an objective of biodiversity conservation. Issue is why in this case not putting an MPA? We are back to the previous question. The answer is maybe because the fisheries management authorities do not have the capacities to put together an MPA, and they should rely on others to do that, and they don't wish to do that because it's their business to put together a FRA. So this is maybe enough for doing that. The other issue is, what about other threats? Are fisheries authorities able to avoid or to prevent or to fight threats coming from other sectors or other economical activities or anywhere else? And this is a true question. I think in any case, FRA in the Med are very good candidates to be an OECMs. Probably they should be done together in collaboration with environment authorities. So I mean, here I'm really free of speech. I think the Barcelona Convention and the GFCM should really work that together. As far as they can work that together, I think they are excellent candidates. If they don't do that together, we'll always have some problem remaining. So my advice here, if I can, is really to put the FRA, to go for the FRA together with GFCM and with the support of the REXPA or the MAP.
Thank you very much, François. Sue wants to.
Well, just to say, yeah, François, that was great, and particularly your point at looking at other threats, because in areas managed for fisheries, if you just assess the fisheries, the impacts on biodiversity from removing the damaging fishing activities, you may get very sort of positive outcome. But as François emphasized, you really have to be looking at the other threats as well. So if it was a sort of area with lots of tourism, an area with oil and gas extraction, there could be anything going on there, as well as the management of the fisheries. And you must remember that for achieving meeting the OECM criteria, you've got to be looking across the board at all the impacts to an area. And it's not just the sector that might cause an impact, it's all the others as well. And this is where the forthcoming OECM guide is quite useful, because they've assessed the impacts from all the most of the different sectors that can have a negative impact on marine biodiversity.
Thank you very much. I think we're getting to the end of this webinar, so that's going to be the concluding word. So big and immense thank you to our speakers. Really, yes, helped us navigate in this unclear concept of OECMs that was said several times. I hope it clarified in the some questions in the audience and some that it met your expectations. I think we went a step further in making these concepts more operational. What I want to add maybe, so I've said that there was going to be a follow-up to this webinar via email with a summary of what was said. There will also be a feedback survey to know what you learned and what you want to, what was maybe missing, or what could be the next steps for you to keep on supporting you. And we will also gather expression of interest from you if you want to keep being informed of what's going on, if you want to keep being in this journey with us, and also with the SPARAC and the IUCN, who are, as you have understood, very active in this adventure on OECMs. So thank you very much. We're 2 minutes behind, so that's basically on time. Thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of the day. And I look forward to seeing you all soon again.